Today on the Big Douglas Show, I welcome Brett Coleman, the creator of the YouTube channel, The Film Room. He does incredible breakdowns. Today I talked to him about how he got started, his new gig with the Chargers, and the best way to create content. If you like the show, make sure you subscribe to my channel, The Big Douglas Show, or on Spotify, Apple. Make sure you leave us some comments and tell us what you think. Always love the feedback. Without further ado, here's my interview with Brett. Brett, how are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on. Enjoying the off season. You know, the one semi decent normal sleep schedule we get all year.
The host of the Film Room on YouTube. Tell me a little bit about how it got started.
So I used to work in TV. I was over in the league's media arm, very low on the totem pole for on the production side of things. And I was a young whippersnapper that wanted to pitch some stuff to my producer, one of my producers at the time, Charlie Uke, who now runs NFL Network, ironically enough. Okay. And I was just kind of like refining these early videos that I didn't really expect to ever get traction publicly. Like I thought I was mainly just making them for internal use because I wanted to pitch stuff about how we could do different XO segments and stuff like that. And then they just started picking up traction. And my wife was like, "Hey, you're not even trying at this and you're succeeding. What happens if you actually try?" And so I ended up leaving TV and taking a shot on YouTube and going into my, God, what year is this? Like, I think next draft will be my 10th draft that I'm covering on YouTube. So I'm going into like year 9 of this. Yeah, it's been a good almost decade.
It's crazy. What is the key to a good YouTube channel? I mean, the YouTube channel is blowing up. I know time is one of those things, but it's not just luck and timing, though. What in your mind makes for a successful YouTube channel?
Patience. Because I think people want to get to the finish line without actually running the race sometimes. Right. And I think that sometimes people are unwilling to make bad content before they can make good content. And like I made some terrible content. And I still look back at stuff that I'll make like 7 months ago and be like, God, that was horrible. But you have to acknowledge that you can't get better without making stuff that you're inevitably not going to like. And I think people want to skip to the part where everything they make is a banger. And it's like nobody gets there without also just making a bunch of bad stuff first. And I think patience is key, not just patience in terms of waiting for the numbers to pop and the algorithm to grab stuff, but patience with yourself to understand that you have to get better 1% at a time and just try to jump these huge leaps and bounds for your own content creation is not going to happen. So you got to be patient with yourself.
For the people trying to get into the space, I think maybe they don't realize what that grind is all about. I mean, when you're talking about doing this, try to explain, if you would, a little bit about the time that it takes to put together a really good YouTube show.
Oh man. I mean, I can barely do one episode a week. Most of the time it's like once every week and a half to 2 weeks. And it used to be where I would do 80 hours a week, every week, all year long. And it's like, come hell or high water, we're getting out one a week. And then I realized that as I started to get closer to and then past 30, that wasn't going to work out long term. So now I spread the 80 hours over 10 days instead of like 8 or whatever it is. So it's still, you know, probably a 60 to 70 hour week on average, but I don't kill myself anymore. But it's a lot of all-nighters. It's a lot of all-nighters. Thankfully, I have to do few of them now than I used to in the past. But like when I was coming up, and I had no choice. Like I was sleeping on an air mattress. We couldn't even afford an apartment. I had no other choice than to do 3 all-nighters in a row to get something out. And I'm not advocating that that's a good thing, but unfortunately it's a necessary thing that a lot of content creators have to go through. Yeah. And it goes back to patience. You just have to believe that you're going to get on the other side of that wall eventually, but you got to get to the top of it first.
In your mind, it's better to put out one excellent show or multiple pretty good shows?
I think perfect is the enemy of good. And I
Okay.
think trying to be a perfectionist is how you end up never releasing anything at all. And that's something that I've always struggled with. My hours that I put into a show is less about perfectionism and more about just the nature of the show that I do. It requires a lot of research, a lot of studying, and it's I can't just sit down and write something. It's like I have to chart the film, I have to take the notes, I have to go check with my coaching buddies to make sure that I'm getting things right in the way that things are actually taught. So my particular type of content, like I can only streamline it to a point. But for other types of sports content, I think sometimes, for workflows that are naturally quicker, I think people sometimes shoot themselves in the foot by artificially stretching out that workload more than they need to, trying to chase perfection when most people just want good.
Right.
And if you hit perfection eventually, great. But it goes back to the just get the good first. And if you try to be perfectionist, you're never going to release anything good, which means you're never going to learn anything from it. So just get stuff out and learn from good and try to get to perfection over long term.
When you're grinding the tape, which is necessary for the content you're putting out, are you in a room with the lights out by yourself? You got music on? Like, how do you prefer grinding the tape? Because it's a grind. I mean, they don't call it grinding the tape for nothing, right?
It's all hours, right? It can be overnight. It can be, I got my coffee with me in the morning and my cat's in my lap and we're just watching, 2006 Bears film or something like that. It depends on what my deadlines are, when I got to get something out, even, what day of the week it is. So unfortunately, I don't ever have a normal 9 to 5 schedule. Which is a blessing and a curse. Like, it's a blessing in the sense that I have flexibility to go to the dentist when I need to. It's a curse in the sense that I still got to make up those hours at some point. And it's probably going to be at 2 a.m. that night. So it's a little bit always.
For people that are just getting into grinding the tape and kind of being in that space, what's something that you think people overvalue maybe in the process?
Ooh. That's a good question. Overvalue. I think sometimes people forget that it's a very human sport, and that sometimes when things don't look like how they're drawn up, it's because somebody made a mistake, and it can look like something entirely different just because somebody makes a mistake. And you have to get a very deep knowledge of general systems and schemes and how things are coached so that you can recognize those mistakes. But sometimes, like, it's not cover 3, they just blew it. It's like it's quarters that they blew. And I think that just comes with experience. But I think sometimes sometimes people assume that players are playing things as they're drawn up all the time when they're actually not. And sometimes they do make mistakes. And so things look entirely different than they're supposed to.
And to your point, you said earlier, and I thought that was good advice for us all, and whatever it is that you do, was that you'll watch the tape and then think, I wonder, did I see that right? Is that the right? And then you check with other people, double check your homework almost, And I think probably, I don't think enough people realize that that's a common occurrence amongst people in the industry that watch tape. Right? Like, you watch the tape and then you say, I wonder, and then check with somebody and see what they think. And probably not enough people do that, right?
Yeah. And I think like a big example is like when people post clips and they say, so-and-so blew this. And I'm like, I mean, I could see why they would think that. But in my experience, this type of, footwork and angle that a safety takes indicates that it's actually this coverage, which means that this other player didn't do their responsibility. So it might not actually be on that corner. It could be on, say, the nickel, or it could be on the other safety. And when I have a question about that, where I'm like, something definitely went wrong, we just don't know entirely what it is, then I'll talk to my coaching buddies and be like, hey, I think this is half quarter. And they hit it with 3 verts to the strong side. Who's supposed to be carrying Cooper Kupp? And then they'll send me an answer of like, well, it depends. Who's the coach? Because they have different rules. And then I'll say, it's Vic Fangio, and then he'll pull up a Vic Fangio playbook and be like, when they're in quarter half against trips, or half quarter against trips, here's who has blah blah blah, and then like we'll talk about it for like 20 minutes, and I'll be like, that makes total sense. Now it's hard for me to translate that into a tweet, but I can translate it into a video, which is why my videos tend to be very long.
What's the best way in your mind if somebody asked you, we're talking about a lot of specific things here football wise, where's the best way to get started learning the game for those that this is what they want to do?
Coaching clinics.
Coaching clinics.
Sure. There's a lot of them on YouTube. Pretty much every subject you can think of has a clinic on YouTube about it. But if not, there are companies that sell massive libraries of coaching clinics. So again, anything you're ever interested in learning, you can learn from a clinic, and then you just kind of tie all these clinics together, and eventually you kind of get like a full, web of knowledge you can draw from.
You got a new gig with the Chargers now, right?
I do. Yeah.
What do they have you doing?
Mostly X's and O's breakdown content. So I did one on Kellen Moore's offense, and how that's going to, translate to the Chargers and I think their philosophical change that's coming for them. And then I'm working on some stuff with their young draft picks, because they took Quentin Johnson at TCU, Deion Henley, linebacker, who I really like, Tui Tuipulotu. They got some really good young players, so I'm doing some stuff on them as well. But the two schematic breakdowns are up live on the Chargers channel right now, and I'm sure Washington fans are ecstatic that Kellen's out of the division now.
Why do you think he didn't get any head coaching gigs? A little more seasoning for him, at least interviews?
I don't know. I think there's different hot hands every cycle, right? And I think Kellen's going to get his eventually. It was interesting that he didn't get as much attention as I expected him to, because you look at the Cowboys offense, like they were top 5 to 7 in pretty much every single category without Dak on the field for 6 games.
Yeah.
So like they were dealing with a whole bunch of injuries. Like Zeke was banged up. It was the Tony Pollard show in the backfield for most of the time, even though they split carries more than they should have. Receiving core was banged up a lot, and they still were an elite offense by virtually every single metric. And I know there was a disagreement between like McCarthy and Kellen in terms of like how much they ran the ball. They were like 7th in rushing. Like, yeah. I don't know. I don't know what their problem with Kellen was. I think their loss is the Chargers' gain. I think the Chargers' offense is going to be amazing because Kellen's a great offensive coordinator. And I think going to the Chargers and letting Kellen be Kellen, I think they're going to just take a flamethrower to a lot of defenses in the AFC. And then Kellen's going to be right back in consideration for head coaching jobs again.
Did you see right before we got started, DeAndre Hopkins got released, flat out released by the Cardinals.
Released.
Not even a post one. They're going to eat the whole $22 million. Just dropped him.
They couldn't even get like a 6th rounder.
Nothing. That's why people thought that the Commanders were going to be able to trade De'Ami Brown. I said, I don't think so. Nobody's getting traded anymore. Yep. Pull it up real quick. Unless it was a fake Adam Schefter tweet, which sometimes without the checks, it's hard to tell, but pretty sure that was a release right before we got started here. So the follow-up question, obviously, is will the Chargers be interested?
Oh, hell yeah, they'll be interested. It's DeAndre Hopkins. Hell, I'm sure the Commanders will give them a call. It's not that they need receivers, but why not, right? Like,
everybody's going to be giving their call, right? Yeah, right before we got started. Not even. Why wouldn't you wait till June 1 for the cap relief? Something is odd. It's an odd situation.
Wow, that's amazing. That's one of the weirdest things I've seen in a long time. Huh. Okay, then. Well, he's probably on the next flight to Kansas City.
Well, yeah. I mean, obviously, if they can figure it out with the cap, and everybody wants to go to Kansas City if given the opportunity, I would assume at this point. Is it the hardest division in football?
AFC West?
Yeah.
If everybody plays to their potential. But unfortunately, last year they didn't. Chargers got super injured. I think they would have been a 12-win team if they didn't get so banged up.
That was their biggest problem, right?
That was their biggest thing, was health. The Raiders were fascinating because they were in so many games where they had the lead and then blew the lead constantly. So like even if you're just taking like regression to the mean into account, they're not going to be where they were last year in terms of record. They're going to be better than they were last year.
Did they upgrade at quarterback?
No.
Right.
I really don't think they did. Not that I dislike Jimmy Garoppolo, but I think Derek Carr is better than he gets given credit for. I don't think that he's an elite quarterback. He's never been an elite quarterback, but I do think he's better than Jimmy G. So I think that I think it's a downgrade, if anything. Again, not by a lot, but it is. The Raiders kind of fascinate me because I think if they just ran it back, we could still be talking about them with double-digit wins this year, just because it's hard for them to blow as many leads as they did 2 years in a row. Like, it was like historically ridiculous, the amount of like blown games they had. But now I'm not so sure, just because I can't trust Jimmy to even be on the field, right? And then Denver, who knows with Sean Payton and Russ? Like, Russ could bounce back and they could be a really good team because on paper they have a great roster. But like, I got no idea what to do with Russell Wilson right now.
Are you a fan of Sean Payton?
Oh, yeah.
That sounds like a ridiculous question, but I have talked to many people who are not as high on Sean Payton as I think the average are, with some of the different things that kind of happen there in New Orleans. So I'm always just curious, like, what people's thoughts of Sean Payton are.
I think it depends if we're talking about Sean Payton as like the offensive designer, or Sean Payton in terms of how he handles like interpersonal relationships in the building. Because I think those can be two different discussions, right? And even Sean would admit that, you know. But if we're just talking about like, can Sean Payton get Russ to cook again as an offensive designer? Like, I think he can. If anybody could, it's going to be him.
And they've got the weapons to be successful. Were you surprised it didn't work for Russ at all last year?
It was a lot of different things.
Weird, right?
I think Hackett was over his skis. They dealt with some key injuries, both up front and to Javonte Williams and to the receiving core. They were really banged up. And Russ just isn't as mobile as he used to be, right? So he used to be able to just kind of get out of stuff and be the great equalizer with his feet. Can't do that anymore. And so he has to learn to adjust his play style, which I think Sean will help him to do. So it was just kind of a confluence of a whole bunch of different bad things happening at once. And it resulted in them being a pretty terrible football team.
Rodgers goes to the Jets. It's interesting how much better, at least on paper, the AFC is than the NFC this year. When is this the biggest gap? When's the last time you can recall a bigger gap between the two? Because it feels like the top talent, like the AFC is loaded, particularly at the quarterback position. You start looking at the top NFC quarterbacks, it's not a treasure trove of quarterbacks.
Yeah, I would say I'm trying to think, because like the late 2000s were like, you know, the 2007 Patriots were cooking, the Colts were great, the Steelers were great. The Ravens hadn't yet gotten Flacco yet, and they didn't go on their run starting in the late 2000s yet. But the Chargers were great. Like the kind of mid to late-ish 2000s era, the AFC had a bunch of really good quarterbacks and good defenses and everything like that. And the NFC was a little bit thinner back then. You know, you had the Giants made a run as a wild card, right? And they won the whole thing as a wild card. But like, there wasn't as much. I don't think it's quite as pronounced as it is right now, but I do think that the AFC in general has been the more top-heavy conference going back to pretty much when like that 2004 quarterback class came in, and it just never let up from there.
When Rodgers hangs it up, how will he be remembered? It's like to me, he's like one of the great quarterbacks of our generation. But to say they weren't successful, I guess maybe is underpinning their achievements. And yet, it feels like he should have more hardware. How will you kind of remember him when it's all said and done?
Similar to Marino, honestly.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, obviously he got one ring, Marino got none. But you look back at Marino's career and you're like, God, how did they not win 4 Super Bowls? And you look at Rodgers the same way. It's like, how were they not winning a Super Bowl every 3 to 4 years for a decade and a half? And I think that indisputably they're both top 5. Well, I don't know if you put Rodgers top 5. Marino's top 5. Rodgers is like somewhere between like 5 to 7, right? Indisputably top 7 quarterback. Let's say that. And there's one ring between the two of them over the course of 30 combined years in the NFL. It's kind of crazy.
It is crazy. And I guess a lot of that is Brady. Where do rings sit with you on Brady? I mean, we have this discussion on like, is Brady number 1? And I get a lot of people say, no, not even close. But the rings, and people say, oh, well, you know, how much of that was the defense and all these things? And it's like, yeah, but still, they got to a lot of them. Where will Brady and the ring discussion rank when it's all sorted out?
It's funny, people bring up the defense, but they completely forget that he dragged that 2011 team kicking and screaming to the Super Bowl when they had a horrible defense. Horrible. You know, and when they went up against the Eagles, and he threw for like 500-something yards in the Super Bowl against the Eagles, and they were a loaded defense. It wasn't always just defensive. Like, obviously, when they beat the Rams, like, yeah, the defense showed up, but the Rams also had a really good defense themselves. So, and he made the play. He made, Hoss wide juke. He made the throw to Gronk to get him in scoring position to win the game. Like, they don't win without that throw. So, I think, people just want to find a reason not to give Brady credit for being the GOAT, as if he just, Jimmy Garoppolo'd his way to all those rings and they ran the ball and he only threw 8 times, like in that NFC Championship game. Like, they think that's how his whole career was. And it's like, no, he sliced and diced people every year for like 2.5 decades. He's the best.
When I talk to guys about quarterbacking, one of the things I hear a lot is accuracy is not something you can really teach. I'm fascinated about Jalen Hurts and kind of where he was when he got into the league, where a lot of people thought he would end up, and frankly, where he's at right now. Has it surprised you?
I think you can't teach accuracy is an old school mentality, because I think it's not that you can't teach accuracy. I just think it's coaches back then didn't know how to. Okay. And now, you have all these quarterback gurus and quarterback coaches that teach kids from their 6-year-old birthday all the way until they're in high school. And so they've coached, we talk about all these kids going through 7-on-7. They've thrown 10,000 passes before they even get to college, right? Well, that means there's a bunch of coaches out there that have coached 10,000 passes. And they're a lot better at it now than they used to be. They're better at communicating. They're better at adapting to the physical skill set of these kids. They don't just try to fit everybody inside, all these square pegs into round holes. They will not be so rigid in terms of mechanics. They'll lean more into what feels good, and then they'll tweak what feels good. And there's just all these kind of new school developers of quarterbacks that also used to be quarterbacks themselves, mind you, that understand what it's like when they were being coached. And so they can kind of learn from mistakes that their coaches made and then adapt that to the younger generation. I think it's not that you couldn't coach it before. It's just that I think the older generation didn't know how to. And now you have all these younger coaches that know how to, and we're seeing the results.
Yeah. No, I like that. That's interesting. You mentioned 7-on-7. How close is the game going to resemble 7-on-7, say 10 years from now? Like, where do you see the game progressing to?
I think it depends on depending on the rule changes we get, right?
Well, assuming that they continue changing the rules.
I think there will always be a physical element to the game. You're always going to run the ball. 12 personnel is always going to exist. 21 personnel is always going to exist. As long as Kyle Shanahan lives and breathes, if you get on the field in lighter personnel, he's going to run the ball down your throat.
That's right.
So there will always be that element. Now, I will say, going back and watching early 2000s and mid 2000s film this week for a project I'm working on with the league, looking at the old Bucs defenses and the Bears defenses and everything like that, those dudes were launching like crazy. Yeah. All the old don't throw over the middle. It's like, yeah, because you're going to get concussed. Like the league took that out of the game. And so people complain that you can throw over the middle now. And it's like, yeah, you could throw over the middle without your receiver getting brain damage. Like that's the key difference here. That's good for the game. It is objectively. Now people complain that there's too much offense now and there's too much passing. And I think it's, again, it's that coaches are adapting and they're learning how to coach defense in this atmosphere. And they're learning how to coach defense without just saying, go kill that guy. There's an adjustment period. There's a lag period. Defense is and will continue to come back as coaches adjust and learn how to actually teach these guys how to cover and not just hit. Go back to the 80s, 90s, 2000s. A lot of it was about imposing your will and make them fear you and everything like that. Not about cover, not about like actually man up and cover. You had some guys that could do it, not enough of them back in that era, but there's more good DBs coming out now than there were in that area because of 7-on-7. All these kids that are learning how to catch passes, well, guess what? Dudes are covering them, so they're learning how to cover too. So again, there's a lag period. Coaches have to adjust how they coach defense, but it doesn't mean that defense won't exist. It just means that it's going to take a few years extra for them to figure out how do we stop a slant without a Mike linebacker sending somebody to the hospital.
We'll use that as a pivot. I want to continue talking about the defense. Let's get to the Commanders a little bit. They built this defense off of a D-line and the secondary. Now they did spend a first round pick on Jamin Davis, but essentially like they're in big nickel 80% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Commanders fans are always telling me that they don't invest enough in the safety position or in the linebacker position. They've only got one and then it drops off. But is that where defense is headed now with the spread offenses, that the linebacker position is not as necessary as it was, particularly not three on the field at the same time? Is that where we're heading, or will we see teams pivot and start running more now as we see teams using linebackers less and less? It's always a pivot game, right?
I think we're already seeing offenses move into bigger personnel. The Packers drafted 2 giant tight ends. The Patriots, when they just went on their run a couple of years ago, is because they ran, a whole bunch of plays out of 12 personnel because they had Gronk, who's basically an extra offensive lineman. The Chiefs were the best offense in the league last year, and they also led the league in 12 and 13 personnel. They were a big team, a ball control team. You look at the 49ers. You look at the Dolphins, like they were more wide open in 11 personnel, but in Mike McDaniel's ideal world, they're going to get 21 personnel on the field because they have a fullback that they really like. So there's a bunch of really good offenses around the league. I mean, God, the Bills just drafted another tight end so they can run 12 personnel more. Like they don't want to be in 11 as much. They want to be in 12.
Yeah.
So you look at all these great offenses around the league, they're getting bigger because defenses got smaller. And so that's actually something that I think the Commanders will have to address is now that they brought in Cody Barton, who I like a lot, but they're going to have to be able to match big people with big people effectively, because as much as they want to spend time in nickel and play coverage and do all the great things in coverage and send the pass rushers, everything like that, if they're giving up 5.5 yards per carry against 12 and 21 and 22 personnel, it's not really going to matter that much. So that's kind of the thing that I'm really eager to see with them is like, can they match up big bodies for big bodies and be effective?
Particularly, they just got Darren Waller into the division too. So the tight end room is getting bigger, to your point. It's fascinating, the cat and mouse game that they play that way. Let's switch it to the other side. You mentioned the Chiefs offense from last year. The Commanders tight end room, although not flashy, are big. I mean, they're all like 6'6" plus. So it feels like they do not have a Kelsey, but only one team does. But it feels like, they went 8-1 last year with a Scott Turner offense. Feels like, and they didn't average 20 points a game last year. Feels like they got a little bit bigger at running back again in the draft. They've got the tight ends. Feels like they'll probably be in 12 a bunch. What did you see Bieniemy's offense bringing to the Commanders?
I think they are going to want to control the ball for sure, especially considering who their quarterbacks are with Howell and Brissett and I don't think we're going to see any Jake Fromm. It's going to be probably just Howell and
We
Brissett.
see Jake Fromm. It's a bad year.
You're in trouble. You're in trouble if they do. But I do think it's going to be, heavy ball control. They're going to want to run the ball 25 to 30, maybe even more times per game. Not that Brian is going to get all the work. I think it's going to be a pretty decent split. But in terms of all their running backs getting work, they probably want to do it 25 to 30 plus times per game, so that their third downs are 3rd and 4, not 3rd and 7. Because I think when they get into 3rd and 7 against the Eagles pass rush, they can get into trouble a little bit there. So I think that definitely is going to carry over. I'm curious to see if they lean into all of the different types of RPO answers they had in Kansas City, where Pat kind of had the freedom at the line of scrimmage, where he would read it, and depending on the numbers, depending on the leverage, depending on what the front and coverage that he was reading, he could kind of look around and get in an RPO and just kind of throw against leverage just to get 4 or 5 yards. Like, why run the ball if we can get 4 or 5 yards outside? I'm curious to see if they lean into that element of the Chiefs offense, because that was very prevalent for them. The one thing that I was really upset by on behalf of Commanders fans was Armani Rogers getting hurt this week.
Brutal.
He is so
He was good
gifted.
last year.
He is so gifted. I saw him at the Shrine Bowl when he showed up, and he was a converted quarterback who was like 6'5", 230, like 4.4 speed, freak athlete. Showed up at the Shrine Bowl, had never taken a rep as a tight end in his life. Showed up at practice and was just killing everybody. And there were so many people that were like, this is Julius Thomas. Like, he's going to be Julius Thomas. And to see him go down like that it's heartbreaking, because I think he was going to be a really big piece for them this year, and a matchup weapon that very few teams have an answer for. So I'm curious to see how they replace the role that I think they were going to envision for him. Obviously Logan Thomas, I think, is a quality tight end, but he was going to give them a different dimension in their 13 personnel stuff. So I'm curious to see how they replace that. But overall, I do think that we are going to see some combination of Terry and Jahan and Logan and maybe Bates, along with Brian Robinson, as like your starting 5 skill position players. That's kind of what I expect.
Where does Terry and Jahan rank in your mind as far as route running pairs?
Ooh, they're up there. They're up there for sure. Because Terry's Terry. Everybody knows that he's amazing. But Jahan, like, were it not for an injury, he could have contended for.
All he did was get open last year.
He's awesome. Yeah. And it's so funny because, like, I wasn't the biggest Jahan Dotson guy when he was coming out in the draft. I was like, I don't know, he's kind of small, got beat up against press coverage. I don't know about that. And then he goes to the NFL and he's killing everybody. And I'm like, where was that? Like, he was great at Penn State, but I didn't see like that particular, just murdering defense DBs in press. I'm like, so you wait to the NFL and all of a sudden you go against better DBs and now you can beat press? Okay. But it's great. It's great for the Commanders, right? He like the one thing that he didn't do well, he got to the NFL and immediately fixed it. And now there's nothing really to complain about with him. He's great.
It sounds like, and it's got Commanders fans worried, and I'm not necessarily sure. I don't agree with them. It sounds like it'll be Charles Leno, Sadiq Charles, Nick Gates, Wiley, and Cosme at guard. And why did they do enough in the offseason as far as the O-line goes to protect a quarterback that's had one NFL game under his belt?
It's not the worst offensive line, but I'd be lying if I didn't say I was worried. Right. Because the NFC East in particular, let alone the rest of the NFC schedule, there's some defensive lines there. And I'm sorry, Micah Parsons against Andrew Wiley is not a matchup you want. I don't care how much they paid him. That's not a matchup you want. Same thing with Hassan Reddick. You got Big Dex over in New York against Gates. Like, it's honestly, and I say this completely truthfully, I think Ricky Stromberg starts. I think he's a better player than Gates. I really do. He was one of my favorite centers in this class. He is an absolute horse in the run game, and he's got a better anchor than Gates. Like, I'd be willing to bet by the end of September, he's the one that's going to be out there.
Interesting. we were talking about the Kansas City offense, and when I went back and looked, McKinnon was second on the team in touchdowns. Do you think that translates to Gibson? Will we finally get, we've been seeing them pound Gibson between the tackles for so long, and it's really not probably what he's best suited for. Do you think we'll finally get in this EB offense a better version of Gibson where he's being put out more and getting more opportunities to catch the ball? Really what he should be doing, right?
Yeah, Brian Robinson will be Pacheco and Gibson will be McKinnon is
Right.
how I look at it, right? It'll be frustrating for fantasy players because they're never going to know who to start. But
That's right.
it'll be good for the Commanders in terms of real football.
Why do you think it is that Bieniemy hasn't gotten a look at a head coaching gig? I mean, it can't just be because everybody thinks Andy Reid's calling the plays. I don't buy that. But I've also heard him give interviews since he's been with the Commanders and frankly has taken the head coaching role, at least through this portion of the offseason. He sounds like he's got the makeup of a head coach to me. What do you think has been?
Your guess is as good as mine. I have no idea. I have no idea. I've tried asking around about it for, 4 years now of I think it was after 2019 when they won the Super Bowl and he still didn't get a job. And I'm like, okay, what are we doing here? What's going on? And I've never really gotten a good answer, because
it's odd.
You hear how his players talk about him. They love him. They talk about him very similar to how Steelers players talk about Mike Tomlin in terms of leadership and everything like that. So I don't know. I really don't know. And maybe if they do super well this year, he'll get a shot next year once he proves that it wasn't just Andy, which we know Andy's heavily involved in play calling and everything like that. And even Matt Nagy was heavily involved. And I've heard that Nagy was the guy, that was really asserting himself in a pretty big role in that offense last year. So I don't really know what the workload split was in Kansas City, but at the same time, I think there's so much more to being a head coach than are you the one that called plays. Some of the best coaches in the league are more locker room leadership, CEO type guys. And from everything I've heard about EB, he's great at that. So I don't know. It's just kind of weird, and I've never really understood it.
You think there's an advantage one way or the other to having an offensive or defensive minded head coach? I guess I've heard it. The problem with having a defensive minded head coach is if you're really good and the offense is humming, then you're losing your offensive coordinator every couple of years. Where at least if you've got an offensive minded head coach and you're winning, at least the offense stays the same, or at least has the same guy running it. Do you think there's a big difference? Does it matter one way or the other?
I don't know if it matters, but I will say, the Rams, part of the reason why, at least until their talent completely fell off a cliff after their Super Bowl run, one of the reasons why the Rams were so consistently good was because even though they were losing coordinators every single year, they still had McVay, right? So everything stayed constant and the same. But even if you're a defensive head coach, if your organization has done a good job of developing young coaches within your system that you trust to take over when guys get poached, it's not that big of a deal. But you have to have a head coach that is good at identifying coaching talent and developing that coaching talent to get them ready to take over that role, which is a lot easier said than done.
What did you think of Sam Howell when he got drafted? What are your thoughts on him now?
He was kind of a tough eval for me because their offense was so weird.
That last year.
Well, when he was at North Carolina, right?
Yeah, right.
Because a lot of it was we are throwing RPOs or we are throwing go balls down the boundary and not a whole lot else. So it was tough for me to kind of figure out how to translate that. You go back to the year before that, and you saw a little bit more pro style stuff. Well, I use the term pro style loosely, more so in terms of full field reads and actually having to go through here's 1, here's 2, here's 3. You saw a little bit more of that the year before, which was good and encouraging. Whereas in the last year, it was we're running RPOs, we're running Howell himself a lot. He rushed for 800 yards or something like that.
Yes.
And if he gets one-on-one outside, he's throwing a go ball. And so it was a tough eval just because you didn't really get to see everything. But then he goes to the NFL, and we only get one game. But it kind of looked like the Hal from the year before that, where it's like, okay, now we're getting to see more. We're getting to see everything. We're getting to see, like, can he work the front side, get to the back side? Is all the quick game stuff, is it RPOs, or is it him actually just like reading shit out, right? And he looked great. Again, small sample size, but he looked really good. So I'm really, really curious to see what happens there this year, because I think that Brissett also looked perfectly fine last year. And I think that if Howell doesn't work out, they still have another guy that can start and feel pretty good about it. But if Howell, is the week 1 starter, which we think he will be, and holds off Brissett, that to me indicates that Commanders might have something there. I'm not going to say that he's going to be an elite quarterback, but getting like a 5th round pick, right?
Yeah.
Getting a starting caliber quarterback that's holding off another starting caliber quarterback in the 5th round has got to be one of the most financially advantageous deals in the entire league.
Yep. It's what everybody's looking for, right? That cheap. Do you think we'll get to a point where they set aside, like, the league gives you like a separate stack of money for quarterback? I mean, we see all these guys are getting the contracts are getting so big. How do they solve it when you start putting 55 million into one position?
I think the league is worried about doing that because it has to be capped, right? The quarterback position has to be capped, or else
you would think so, yeah.
Or else agents will run out the clock on 6 years, and then you're going to get a situation where, let's say it's Joe Burrow. If there is a separate quarterback money pool that is uncapped, Joe Burrow's agent could be like, "Hey, we love Cincinnati, but there's a bunch of owners out there that are worth $15 billion more than the Cincinnati ownership group." They'll run out the clock, and everybody's going to be looking at Denver because the Walton family has like $80 billion. So there still has to be a cap for quarterbacks, even if the pool is separate, or else everybody's going to look at the richest owners and be like, "Give my guy $100 million a year," and they're not going to blink. Like, you think?
I was suggesting
$100 million for Joe Burrow right now, like. So
right. A separate capped pool.
Yeah, it would have to be capped, and then the question becomes, okay, what is the percentage raise that the league is willing to allow per year on the previous top contract, which the players union will vehemently oppose, because they're going to be like, no, we don't want to be restricted in terms of what the annual raise can be, because right now there is no restriction. Like, it's just whatever teams are willing to pay.
Yeah.
So on one hand, you're going to have they're all wealthy, but the less wealthy owners, they're going to be like, we need a cap. And the players union is going to be like, no way in hell are you restricting the amount of raise. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know that as it stands right now, things are getting a little bit out of control. And even with the salary cap as it is right now, there's a lot of owners that are struggling with it.
Yeah.
And that's why, like, the Cincinnati deal is going to be really interesting to see, because, like, they did the stadium naming rights deal solely so that they could pay for Joe Burrow's deal. They did not have the cash to do it without that naming rights deal.
Interesting. Right. Right. Let's get out of here on this one. I always kind of wrap up the same way. What advice would you give to young folks that are kind of like trying to get into the space, get to where you're at now? What is some advice you would give to them?
Don't be discouraged by failure, because it's going to happen. Embrace it, learn from it. Like, again, I'm a decade into this at this point, and I still fail all the time. And that's good, because it teaches me lessons. It teaches me what I can do, what I can't do. And it reminds you that you're not infallible. It reminds you that you still have to grind, and you still have to work, and you still have to adapt. And if you're not changing, you're dying. So don't be discouraged by failure. Failure is good. Obviously, you want to get some wins in there too, but it's hard to get the wins without first learning from the failure. So just don't be discouraged by it. Just keep going.
You like to win a little bit more than you lose, for sure.
Yeah, if we can just get like 51%, then we're fine.
Brett, I appreciate today, man. This was a lot of fun. Enjoy your weekend. Big plans for the holiday weekend?
Moving.
Moving.
So that's
fun.
Very nice plans for me.
I appreciate you, buddy. This was fun.
Thanks for having me.